The rejected Omega returned for revenge, but the Alpha King's obsession destroyed her plan. The night was quiet, but the wind carried whispers, ancient murmurs of the kingdom's past, of lost heirs and broken promises. Under the silver light of the moon, the walls of the capital city rose like jagged teeth from the mist, each tower crowned with banners of the Alpha King. Yet in the shadows, unseen, moved a figure whose return had been whispered about in fear and rumor. Seraphine had come back. Once she had walked these streets with the favor of the throne, the promise of the court's respect, and the admiration of those who believed her a destined Omega. But betrayal had severed her life like a blade cutting through silk. The Alpha King, Kale, had looked into her eyes and seen not a queen, not a partner, but a threat to his power. And so she had been cast out, exiled to the forgotten lands beyond the eastern hills, left to wander in silence, to survive and to plan. Her return was not for forgiveness. It was not for peace. It was for something far sharper, revenge. The city gates had changed little. Guards, young and stiff, patrolled with the precision of those taught obedience but not curiosity. Seraphine's cloak of deep midnight blue blended with the shadows as she passed unseen. The streets were empty at this hour, and she moved like a shadow herself, soft steps on cobblestones, her eyes scanning the palace in the distance. Kale's palace was a fortress, towering over the city like a sentinel of fear. Its walls were carved with the sigils of past kings, its gates lined with statues of warriors long dead. Within these walls, the man who had broken her once held court with the cold certainty of a man who knew he commanded the world. Yet Seraphine could feel it even from here, an aura of restlessness, an unspoken void in Kale's life that only she could see. She had learned much during her exile. The forests beyond the eastern hills were alive with magic older than the kingdom itself. Spirits whispered in the trees, teaching her secrets she had never dreamed of, weaving shadows into a tapestry of hidden power. Her once gentle hands now could summon shadows that clung to the night, shadows that could twist perception, stir fear, and bend attention without touching a single soul. Her plan was simple, elegant, like a blade hidden beneath a cloak. She would move through the palace unseen, sowing doubt and tension among the courtiers, turning allies into enemies and forcing Kale into situations where his own obsession would betray him. But there was a danger she had not anticipated. Every time she caught sight of him, the memory of rejection stirred something she thought long buried, a flicker of longing that made her heart thrum in an unfamiliar rhythm. It was during the feast of the crescent moon that she made her first move. The palace was alive with light, candles shimmering like stars caught in crystal. Nobles whispered in corners, plotting alliances and betrayal, each mask hiding ambition. Seraphine, hidden behind the mask of a visiting noblewoman from the southern provinces, watched Kale carefully. He sat at the head of the hall, regal, unyielding, his eyes scanning the room with sharp intelligence. Every motion was controlled, every gesture deliberate. Yet even as he smiled at those who sought his favor, she could see the restlessness beneath, the invisible chains of obsession she had yet to understand. Her entrance was subtle. A hand on a golden railing, a whispered greeting to the guards, and she melted into the crowd. The court did not notice her. None of them remembered the Omega who had been exiled. They only remembered a shadow of a girl, a rumor, a forgotten name. But Kale noticed. He did not look at her as he would any other guest. His gaze lingered, a spark of recognition, a flicker that made the air between them taut with unspoken tension. Seraphine's pulse quickened, though she masked it with a calm smile. She had anticipated his curiosity, even expected it, but it unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Throughout the evening, she moved like a phantom, observing, listening. Words of betrayal floated through the hall, whispered secrets of nobles conspiring against Kale. Each tidbit she collected would later be used as a tool, a lever to shift power in her favor. She had become a master of subtlety, of suggestion, of shadowed influence. But all the while, Kale's eyes found her more often than any other, and every glance chipped at her carefully constructed walls. It was near the end of the evening, as the candles burned low, that a young courtier, perhaps sensing her presence, brushed past her and murmured a warning. "Do not linger near the king. He does not forget easily, and he does not forgive." Seraphine only smiled faintly. She did not fear Kale, not yet. Fear had been replaced with something sharper, purpose, and purpose would guide her, not sentiment. But sentiment, as she had already discovered, was not so easily banished. Later that night, Seraphine found herself alone in the palace gardens. The moon hung low, silver light spilling over hedges and fountains. The scent of night-blooming flowers mingled with the faint smoke of torches, creating an atmosphere of fragile serenity. She had come to this quiet place to plan her next move, to think beyond the walls of intrigue. It was here that Kale appeared, not with guards, not with ceremony, but silently, as if he had known she would be here. He stepped from the shadows, his presence commanding, and yet in the stillness of the garden there was an unmistakable vulnerability in his posture. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady but not without curiosity. "You should not be here." "I am a traveler," Seraphine said lightly, keeping her disguise. "I mean no harm." Kale's gaze did not waver. "You are not what you seem. Something about you I cannot place, but I know you do not belong among the court." A thrill of danger ran through her veins. He did not know her yet, and perhaps that was her advantage. "Perhaps I belong nowhere," she said, her voice soft but deliberate, letting just enough intrigue slip through. Kale took a step closer, and for the first time, Seraphine felt the magnetic pull she had feared. There was a tension between them, a dangerous energy that neither could deny. And in that tension, she glimpsed the first fracture in her plan. For even as she had sworn to wield him as a tool, she felt the faintest echo of something more, something that could unravel all she had worked for. "You intrigue me," Kale said quietly, a shadow of a smile crossing his lips. "Be careful. Intrigue is a dangerous thing in my halls." And for some it becomes obsession. Seraphine's heart skipped. The word struck her like a bell tolling in the still night. Obsession. She had counted on fear, on cunning, on secrets. She had not counted on desire. As he stepped back into the shadows, leaving her alone among the moonlit flowers, Seraphine realized the true challenge of her return. It was not simply to take revenge. It was to maintain her heart, her mind, her purpose, against a man whose power and obsession could destroy all her plans. The night deepened, and Seraphine melted into the shadows once more, moving through the palace unseen. She had begun the first steps of her strategy, but already the king's silent gaze haunted her. Every whispered secret she gathered, every subtle manipulation she planted, carried the risk of revealing herself too soon. And Kale was no longer just a man to outwit. He was a force, one that would test her in ways she had not foreseen, one that could unravel even the most carefully constructed layers of her vengeance. The first threads of her plan were cast into the world, delicate and precise, like a spider weaving its web. But webs are fragile, and even as she moved through the shadows of the palace, unseen and unheard, Seraphine could not deny the truth she had been trying to ignore. The man who had once rejected her held a fascination she could neither control nor fully understand. And in that realization, the Omega who had returned for revenge understood something else. Perhaps the deadliest challenge of all was not the palace, the king, or the court. Perhaps it was herself. The night held its breath, the wind whispering through the gardens like a warning. Somewhere beyond the walls, the city slept, oblivious to the danger that had returned to its heart. And in the palace, unseen and unchallenged, Kale's thoughts lingered on a stranger in the moonlight, on a presence that should have meant nothing but now meant everything. Seraphine's eyes, dark and luminous beneath her hood, watched the palace gates. The hunt had begun. The game of shadows, secrets, and desire had begun. And she knew, with a thrill that mixed fear and exhilaration, that nothing would ever be the same again. The palace seemed alive in a way Seraphine had not remembered. Every corridor whispered secrets. Every candle flicker seemed to echo her heartbeat. She had spent weeks observing, learning and weaving threads of influence through whispers and subtle gestures. The nobles believed her a visiting envoy from the southern provinces, but they did not know that she had returned as something far more dangerous, a shadow with purpose, a force with memory and skill sharpened by exile. Kale, the Alpha King, remained the center of every whispered word, every wary glance. Seraphine had learned that power was often subtle, and the way to topple a king was rarely through open confrontation. The palace itself was her battlefield, and every ally, every courtier a piece to manipulate. Yet, despite her careful control, Kale's presence haunted her. It was not only the fascination in his gaze, but the quiet intensity of his focus, the way he noticed everything yet betrayed nothing. The first time she encountered him since that moonlit garden, it was in the grand library. The hall stretched high with shelves of ancient tomes, the scent of old paper mingling with the faint tang of incense. She moved through the aisles, seeking a scroll rumored to contain knowledge of the bloodlines of Omegas. As she reached for it, a hand touched hers. "You are drawn to knowledge or perhaps trouble," Kale said, his voice low, calm, yet with an undertone that made her pulse tighten. Seraphine did not startle. "I seek only the truth," she replied, her tone steady, though her mind raced. Kale's eyes narrowed, searching hers, as if trying to peel away the disguise she wore like armor. "Truth is a dangerous thing in my halls," he said softly. "Some truths are meant to be buried." And yet, he did not pull away. There was a tension between them, an invisible thread of challenge and attraction that neither could deny. Seraphine realized that her careful plan to manipulate him might already be faltering. His obsession, quiet and insistent, grew with every encounter. Over the next days, she moved through the palace with careful precision. Words planted here, doubts sown there. She discovered rival nobles plotting in secret, unaware that their own schemes could be turned to her advantage. She whispered hints, leaving subtle trails of suspicion. And everywhere Kale was near, not openly, not aggressively, but always aware, always present, as if drawn to her like a force he could not resist. It was during a council meeting that the danger of this obsession first revealed itself. Seraphine, seated among visiting nobles, listened as ministers debated alliances and trade. One whispered fear of rebellion, another hinted at hidden enemies. She allowed her eyes to drift toward Kale, noting how his jaw tightened when he sensed unease. His gaze lingered on her, a silent question, a silent acknowledgement. And in that moment, she felt the first true stirrings of conflict within herself, a desire to draw close to the man she had returned to destroy. The tension between them escalated in quiet, stolen moments. In the gardens, in the library, in corridors lined with torchlight, they exchanged words loaded with double meaning. Every glance, every movement carried weight. Seraphine had never intended for him to see beyond the surface, yet every time he looked at her, he seemed to pierce the shadow she had crafted around herself. One evening she found herself walking alone through the eastern tower, where the light of dusk spilled through arched windows. Kale followed her silently, not surprising her now. She had come to expect his presence. "Why do you hide in shadows?" he asked, stepping beside her. His tone was neither accusing nor gentle, merely observant. Seraphine paused, her fingers brushing the stone railing. "Perhaps I am learning that shadows can speak louder than words," she said. Kale studied her for a long moment. "Or perhaps you hide because you are afraid." Fear, the word struck her, not for her own sake, but for the truth it revealed about him. His obsession, though unspoken, was rooted in more than curiosity. It was worry, a desire to understand what he could not control. And in that obsession, She saw both vulnerability and danger. Days passed. Her plans continued to unfold with subtle brilliance. Noble alliances shifted at her suggestion. Secrets she whispered in the ears of the curious spread like wildfire. She reveled in the delicate artistry of her revenge. Yet each day, Kale's attention became harder to deflect. One night, she discovered a hidden chamber beneath the palace. Within, ancient runes glowed faintly on the walls, a ritual space long abandoned but still potent with power. The scrolls she had sought spoke of a curse tied to the bloodlines of the Alpha Kings, a curse that could consume them if unchecked. Seraphine realized that her return was more than personal revenge. It was entwined with destiny. Her powers, sharpened by years of exile, could influence not just Kale but the very fate of the kingdom. And yet the more she learned, the more she felt the pull of something dangerous. Kale's obsession was growing, and it was no longer simply curiosity. He sought her, even when he told himself otherwise. She caught him in quiet corners, observing her from a distance, his gaze lingering longer than propriety allowed. The most difficult moment came during the Festival of the Silver Stars. The palace was decorated with lanterns and garlands, the streets alive with music and laughter. Seraphine moved through the crowd, blending in, listening to rumors and plans, planting seeds of intrigue. Kale found her among the revelers, his eyes searching, tracking. "You move like a ghost," he said, appearing at her side without warning. "Do you always hide in plain sight?" Seraphine's heart skipped, but she maintained her composure. "Sometimes ghosts must move among the living," she replied, carefully neutral. Kale's expression softened for a fleeting moment, the only time she saw the man beneath the crown, the man who carried the weight of obsession and fear. "Even ghosts leave traces," he murmured. It was not an accusation. It was a warning. And in that warning, Seraphine realized her control might be slipping. She had intended to manipulate him, to turn him into a pawn. But his obsession, his intensity, was a force she could not ignore, and it awakened something she had not expected, an awareness of her own longing, her own vulnerability. That night, as the festival lights burned low and the city quieted, Seraphine returned to the hidden chamber. She traced the glowing runes with her fingers, feeling the ancient magic pulse beneath her touch. The curse of the Alpha King's bloodline was real, and it was stronger than even she had imagined. It would require not just skill, but courage to confront. And yet, she knew that confronting it would mean confronting Kale, not as an enemy, but as a force she could no longer treat with detachment. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft sound, the rustle of a cloak in the shadows. Kale emerged from the darkness, his eyes glowing in the dim light. "I wondered if you would come here," he said quietly. "The night suits you as it always did." Seraphine's pulse quickened. She had expected confrontation, argument, perhaps a challenge. She had not expected fascination, not this quiet intensity that pressed against her will like a tide. "You follow me," she said, more statement than question. He stepped closer, the air between them charged. "I do not follow," he said softly. "I am drawn. And when something draws me, I cannot look away." It was both a warning and a confession. Seraphine felt a shiver run through her. Here was a man who ruled kingdoms, who commanded armies, yet was vulnerable in ways no one else had ever seen. And she realized that her plan, so carefully crafted in the shadows, was already at risk of unraveling. "You are dangerous," she said, meeting his gaze. "Not for yourself, but for me. I cannot let you interfere with what I must do." Kale's expression softened, but there was an intensity in his eyes that made her chest tighten. "Perhaps," he said, "but sometimes what we cannot interfere with is exactly what we must face together." The words lingered in the chamber, heavy and intoxicating. Seraphine knew that her return for revenge was no longer just about reclaiming what was taken. It was about navigating the dangerous currents of desire, obsession, and power that now bound them both. As she melted into the shadows, retreating from his gaze, she realized that the game had changed. Her revenge would not be simple, her manipulations would not go unnoticed, and the very man she had sworn to destroy or control was becoming the center of her conflicted heart. The palace walls were alive with secrets. Whispers floated through the corridors like drifting petals, carrying the weight of ambition, fear, and old grudges. Seraphine moved among them like a shadow, listening, observing, weaving threads of subtle influence. Every noble she passed could become a pawn, every misstep an advantage. But now, she realized, the stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. Kale's obsession with her was no longer subtle. Every encounter, every glance, every brush of her presence carried an intensity that made her pulse quicken and her mind tighten. She had come back to claim revenge, yet every step she took toward that goal drew her closer into a current she could not control. It was in the council chamber that the first true test of her resolve appeared. The room was lined with mirrors, gilded frames reflecting candlelight, and the wary eyes of the king's advisors. They spoke of rebellion, of enemies beyond the borders, and of the lingering shadows of ancient curses that haunted the royal lineage. Seraphine sat among the visitors, pretending to examine the maps laid before her, but her attention was fixed on Kale. His fingers drummed lightly on the table, a controlled motion hiding the storm within. His gaze found her and lingered, a silent warning, a silent claim. She could feel the pull between them, a dangerous attraction that had nothing to do with affection and everything to do with power. A young advisor spoke of unrest in the eastern provinces, suggesting that Seraphine's return might embolden the people who remembered her name. The room's murmurs rose, tension sharpening. Kale's jaw tightened, and he leaned slightly toward her, as though her presence alone could steady the rising panic. Seraphine's lips curved in a small, measured smile. She allowed the whisper of doubt to spread among the courtiers, just enough to shift the tide, just enough to remind them that the shadows could move through the palace unnoticed. She had come back for revenge, and she would have it, but the currents were changing. Kale's obsession was a force she could not anticipate, and it threatened to turn her carefully crafted plan into something uncontrollable. Later that night, she returned to the hidden chamber beneath the palace, where the glowing runes cast pale light on the walls. Her fingers traced the ancient symbols, feeling the pulse of the magic that had been waiting for her. The curse of the Alpha King's bloodline was no simple threat. It was a living force, a shadow that twisted fate and bound the hearts of those in its reach. Kale appeared at the chamber's entrance without a sound, as though he had walked through the shadows themselves. "You cannot face this alone," he said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of his obsession. Seraphine's eyes flicked to him, sharp and cold. "I do not need help," she said, but the words felt brittle even to her own ears. "You underestimate me," Kale said softly, stepping closer. "I know your past, your pain, your power, and I will not let it consume you or me." She wanted to push him away, to remind him that he was a king and she was an exiled Omega. But the truth was undeniable. Without him, the curse could claim the throne and destroy everything she had returned to protect. And yet, trusting him risked everything she had planned. Days passed with tension building in every corner of the palace. Seraphine's influence among the nobles continued to grow, but Kale's obsession shadowed her every move. When she whispered doubts to one advisor, Kale countered with authority, revealing knowledge that made her wonder how much he truly understood. He was more than a man driven by desire. He was a ruler with instincts sharper than she had imagined. In the gardens one evening, the moonlight silvered the fountains and cast long shadows. Seraphine paced the stone paths, her thoughts tangled in the web of plans and feelings she could not untangle. Kale approached silently, stepping into the glow of the moon. "You are restless," he said, his tone calm yet probing. "I am always restless in my own shadow," she replied, her voice careful, her eyes avoiding his. He closed the distance between them, his presence pressing against her resolve. "The shadows cannot hide you from me," he said. "And the more I see, the more I understand, the more I am compelled. You are not just a threat or a tool, you are something I cannot leave behind." Her chest tightened. She had expected anger, confrontation, strategy, but not this. Not the force of his obsession, a dangerous pull that threatened to undo her carefully guarded heart. The palace grew more tense each day. Allies whispered of her return, of the subtle influence she wielded, of the growing unease among the nobles. And Kale's obsession did not wane, it sharpened. He began seeking her out, not for confrontation, not for diplomacy, but with an intensity that made her wonder if her revenge could survive him. The real test came when the palace was threatened from within. A secret faction loyal to a long-forgotten rival had infiltrated the court, and their plans could unravel everything. Seraphine discovered their presence first, her shadow senses alerting her to whispers and signs the others could not see. She considered exposing them to the court, using it as a demonstration of her power, but every move carried risk. Kale's obsession could interfere, and she did not yet know if his intervention would help or hinder her. In a quiet confrontation, she confronted the faction in the East Wing. Shadows curled around her like protective arms, her presence commanding and precise. The conspirators faltered, confusion in their eyes, until Kale stepped forward from the darkness behind her, his eyes fixed on her. "You cannot do this alone," he said again, his voice unwavering. Seraphine turned, her eyes meeting his. "Perhaps," she admitted, though reluctantly, "but I have controlled my own fate for years. I will not let even you change it." Kale's gaze softened, but the obsession in his eyes did not fade. "Control is an illusion," he said. "And sometimes we must let someone else share the burden, even if it means risking everything." The conspirators retreated, defeated by the unity of shadow and steel, and yet Seraphine felt a pang of unease. Kale's presence had saved her plan, but at what cost? His obsession was no longer subtle. It was a force that could consume him, her, and the throne. That night, she walked alone through the hidden gardens, replaying every moment in her mind. Her revenge, so carefully crafted, was already shifting. The lines between desire and strategy blurred. The king's obsession was a tide she could not fight, and the more she resisted, the more she realized that her own heart was responding in kind. The following days brought more challenges. Rumors of rebellion spread, the nobles grew suspicious, and Kale's obsession became both a shield and a threat. Every whisper she planted, every doubt she sowed, carried the risk that Kale's intense focus might unravel it. She had returned for revenge, yet the currents of attraction and obsession were making her question whether she could follow through without losing herself. In a rare moment of solitude, she returned to the hidden chamber, tracing the ancient runes once more. She realized that the curse binding Kale's bloodline was more dangerous than she had understood. Its threads touched not just power and throne, but hearts and souls. And in order to break it, she would need more than shadows and strategy. She would need him. Kale appeared at the chamber's entrance once more, silent, commanding. "The closer you come to understanding the curse," he said, "the closer you come to understanding me, and neither of us can ignore what that means." Her breath caught. "I did not return to understand you," she said, though the words felt hollow. "I returned to claim what was taken, to take revenge." He stepped closer, the intensity in his gaze unyielding. "Revenge may destroy you, or it may destroy me. But perhaps together we can face what no one else can." Seraphine hesitated. She had spent years building this plan, perfecting every step. And yet, for the first time, she considered the possibility that her heart, her desires, might be a force even she could not control. The next day, the palace erupted in chaos. The hidden faction struck, and Kale was wounded defending the throne. Seraphine acted quickly, using her shadow powers to protect him, to turn the tide of the attack. Her plan of revenge was no longer hers alone. It had become entwined with Kale's obsession, with the fragile bond forming between them. In the aftermath, as the wounded were tended and the conspirators defeated, Seraphine found herself alone in the moonlit gardens once more. Kale approached, his steps measured, his gaze heavy with emotion and unspoken words. "You risked everything for me," he said softly. "I risked nothing," she replied at first, masking her own trembling heart. "I only acted to protect my plan." He shook his head. "No. You risked yourself, and in doing so, you risked me." Her fingers brushed the stone railing, tracing the edges of the fountain where shadows danced in silver light. She realized that her plan, her careful revenge, had already been altered. Kale's obsession was no longer something she could manipulate. It was a force of its own, pulling at her, challenging her, and threatening to destroy everything she had returned to claim. The palace was quiet, but it was a tense quiet, the kind that comes before a storm. Seraphine stood atop the eastern tower, the wind tugging at her cloak, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon where shadows twisted unnaturally. The rebellion had been suppressed, the conspirators punished, but the palace itself was still haunted by whispers of curses and ancient power. She had returned to claim revenge, yet everything she had built had shifted. Her plan, her careful manipulations, were no longer her own. Kale's obsession had entwined with her destiny, and now she faced a choice that would determine not just her future, but the fate of the kingdom itself. Kale approached quietly, his armor glinting faintly in the moonlight, his expression unreadable. He had been wounded during the last skirmish, and though he carried himself with the same commanding presence, she could see the fatigue in his eyes. Yet there was no weakness, only determination, a determination that was now tied to her in ways she could neither control nor fully understand. "You've seen the palace," Kale said softly, stepping beside her. "You know the danger is not over. The curse, it grows stronger, and it seeks more than just me. It seeks the throne itself." Seraphine's fingers brushed the railing. "I know," she replied, her voice calm though her heart throbbed. "And I know that facing it alone will cost everything, perhaps even you." He looked at her sharply as if weighing her words. "Then we face it together," he said. "There is no other way. The shadows will not relent, and neither can we." The night deepened, and the moonlight bathed the palace gardens in silver. Seraphine led Kale to the hidden chamber beneath the palace, where the glowing runes hummed with ancient power. She had studied them for weeks, tracing the flow of energy, understanding their meaning. This was the source, the heart of the curse that had haunted the Alpha Kings for centuries. Kale's gaze lingered on the symbols, then shifted to her. "This is yours as much as mine," he said. "Do not hide behind shadows now. We must face this together." Seraphine took a deep breath, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down on them. The curse was more than a threat. It was a living force, a shadow that fed on obsession, desire, and the fear of loss. To confront it would require them to bind their power together, to risk themselves completely. She nodded, steeling herself. "Then we begin." They began the ritual, moving through the steps that had been written on the ancient scrolls. Seraphine channeled her shadow magic, weaving it around Kale's essence, linking their strength. The runes glowed brighter, pulsing with a light that made the chamber tremble. The curse reacted, twisting shadows around them, testing their resolve. "You must trust me," Kale said, his hand brushing hers. His voice carried a quiet intensity that made her heart quicken. "Whatever happens, do not let fear take you." "I trust you," she whispered, though her mind raced with uncertainty. This trust, she realized, was more dangerous than any blade. The shadows surged and the room darkened. The walls of the chamber seemed to stretch, the ancient magic pressing against them, testing their will. Seraphine felt the pull of revenge, the temptation to use the power for herself to reshape the past. But she also felt the presence of Kale, steady and unwavering, a force beside her rather than against her. "Together," she said, tightening her grip on his hand. "Together we end this." The runes flared and the curse screamed, twisting the shadows into monstrous shapes. Kale's voice rang out, steadying her, grounding her in the moment. Their combined strength pushed against the darkness, weaving light and shadow into a force of balance. And then, in a moment that felt both infinite and fleeting, the shadows recoiled. The chamber brightened, the glow of the runes softening into calm luminescence. The curse had been confronted, and though its presence lingered faintly, its power had been broken. Seraphine sank to her knees, exhausted but alive. Kale knelt beside her, his hand warm against hers, his eyes filled with awe and something deeper, gratitude, respect, and perhaps love. "You did it," he said softly. "We did it." She shook her head, smiling faintly. It was not just magic, it was choice. Choice to face it together rather than let revenge consume us. Kale's gaze softened, and he lifted her chin gently as if to read the truth in her eyes. "You are not just powerful," he said. "You are something greater. You have saved not just the kingdom but me, and in doing so, you have changed everything." The palace was quiet again, the lingering tension replaced by a fragile peace. Outside, the city slept under the silver glow of the moon. Within the walls, the Alpha King and the Omega who had returned for revenge stood side by side, their bond tested by shadows, obsession, and the choices they had made. Days passed, and the palace began to breathe again. Nobles whispered of change, of the king's new humility, and of the mysterious Omega who had returned to confront not just her past, but the fate of the kingdom itself. Seraphine's influence remained, but it was no longer a tool of revenge. It was a force of guidance and balance. Kale sought her out often, not with obsession, but with understanding. They walked the gardens together, discussed the affairs of the throne, and sometimes simply stood in silence, sharing the quiet moments that spoke more than words ever could. The tension that had once been dangerous had transformed into something else: mutual respect, trust, and the beginnings of love that was steady rather than consuming. Yet Seraphine knew that the shadow of the curse, though broken, would linger. It was a reminder that power, desire, and obsession could never be fully controlled. And in that knowledge lay the strength they now shared, the strength to face the future together. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Seraphine and Kale stood atop the palace tower. The wind tugged at their cloaks, and the city stretched endlessly beneath them. "You changed everything," Kale said, his voice quiet, reflective. "I was consumed by obsession, by desire for control, and you showed me a different way, a better way." Seraphine smiled, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "We both changed," she said. "The past does not define us. Our choices do." Kale reached for her hand, and this time there was no tension, no danger, only connection. "Then let us face the future, not as king and Omega or as predator and shadow, but as equals." Her heart, once hardened by betrayal, softened. She had returned for revenge, yet in the end, she found something she had not expected: redemption, not just for herself, but for the man who had once rejected her, and for the kingdom that had been caught between shadows and desire. As the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, Seraphine felt the quiet satisfaction of completion, not vengeance, not obsession, but balance. And in that moment, she understood the true power she held: the power to choose, the power to forgive, and the power to love without losing herself. And yet, even in this calm, a whisper of the past lingered. The shadows of the kingdom had not fully vanished. They were merely waiting, observing, reminding those who ruled that vigilance was eternal. But for now, the Alpha King and the Omega stood together, their bond forged in shadow and fire, stronger than any curse, stronger than any plan of revenge. Kale turned to her, his eyes reflecting the soft light of the evening. "The kingdom is safe because of you," he said. "Because of us." Seraphine took a deep breath, her hand in his, her heart steady. "Then let it be a kingdom of hope, not fear, and let us walk forward together." The palace gates glimmered beneath the starlight, the city alive with quiet promise. The past had tested them, the shadows had challenged them, and the curse had threatened to consume them. But they had endured. And as the wind whispered softly through the towers and gardens, Seraphine knew one truth. Even in darkness, the light of choice and love could prevail. The Omega who had returned for revenge had not only survived, but transformed the destiny of the Alpha King, the kingdom, and herself. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel peace.